All right, moving on to day 3, God says, verse 9, "Then God said, let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the waters he called seas, and God saw that it was good." Now the pattern should really start to make sense to you, right? We're flowing much better now. You can see how God is doing this. He's doing it very systematically based on physics, not based on some arbitrary desire to do things in a certain way. So God now has gathered, it says, all of the waters so that dry land appears. And if you have a sphere of water, which is what we're starting with, right? And you gather all the waters on a sphere, anyone who's a geometry whiz, you can think about it for a minute. If I take a sphere and I take all the things that are on the surface and gather them to one place, well then what would that say about the land? The land would all have to be in one place as well, right? So I have all the water of this planet, all of it in one place, and then as I begin to move all the water away, I begin to create a single continent on the planet. So the land of planet Earth began as a single continent. And by the way, scientists would tell you very much the same thing. In fact, it's pretty clear when you look at the structure of continents and how they appear to have just come from one another. They look like a jigsaw puzzle that's been pulled apart. The problem, of course, is when you hear a scientist explain why they think it's separated or how long it took for it to separate. Those are matters of conjecture that have depended upon false theories. But the Bible makes it very clear that it's not wrong to conclude that all the land of the world started in one place. I'll give you one guess what the Bible says thrust all of that apart into its present form. The flood. So the flood of chapters 6 through 9 is the reason why the land is no longer the way it looks right now in this picture. But it did start that way as God intended. And the appearance of the land leads God to name the waters below the expanse now as seas. So we saw in the earlier chart where we had atmosphere on top and waters below. Now we have a name for the bottom part, seas. So that's the water below the atmosphere. Interestingly, though, the new heavens and new earth, the one that's coming, as I said earlier, it has no seas. Revelation 21:1 says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth passed away, and there is no longer any sea." So why is God taking away the seas? Why was a sea necessary and even good, he says, in the first creation, but it's not so good for the next creation? Well, remember what I said earlier, that there are things being done in this creation that help God explain to a coming population of humans, a coming population on the earth, about sin and about redemption and about the need for salvation. And so, for example, in Job, the word deep here is the same word that we saw earlier for tehom. The deep says, "It is not in me," and the sea says, "It is not with me." Water becomes hard like a stone, and the surface of the deep is imprisoned. I'm just showing you these verses because I want you to see how the author associates the word deep and the word sea, and the word water and the word deep. Here again, the word deep is the same one we saw in the earlier verse of Genesis, the tehom, the deep, dark nothingness. And then Psalms takes it a step further. He established the earth upon its foundations so that it will not totter forever and ever. You covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters were standing above the mountains. There's that association again. So waters can be described as the deep. Similarly, the deep in Hebrew, tehom, is also a metaphor for eternal judgment at death. The idea of going down into something deep and bottomless and dark, and you can never come up out of it again. In fact, the Jews were so clear in their mind on the association between a deep sea and hell or judgment that's why they generally were not seagoing people. Even though they had a coast, they did not generally spend a lot of time on the water. Psalmist says this in Psalm 71:20, "You have shown me many troubles and distresses, will revive me again, and will bring me up again from the depths of the earth," tehom again. Or the psalmist says, "Your righteousness is like the mountain of God. Your judgments are like a great tehom. O Lord, you preserve man and beast." And finally, Genesis 49:25, "From the God of your father who helps you, and by the Almighty who blesses you, with blessings of heaven above," notice the contrast, heaven above, blessings of the deep, the tehom that lies beneath, blessings of the breast and of the womb. So what we're learning is God made seas. He put deep waters on the earth in the first creation so that they could be useful as a picture of death and judgment, of going down in an irretrievable way, inescapable way. That metaphor is not present in the second creation because there's no death in the second creation. There's no sin in the second creation. There's no judgment. Revelation 21:4, he says, he will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and there will no longer be any death, and there will no longer be any mourning or crying or pain. The first things have passed away. So we have things like dark and seas today, in part because God uses them in Scripture as metaphors to make a point to our psyche, to our understanding of these things. Because actually, who could understand things like death and judgment before it actually comes upon us? We can only understand it in a distant way. But metaphors are very useful to God in making the point. Once the real issue of sin, death, and judgment is gone, as it will be in the new creation, well, then the metaphors have no purpose anymore either. And so he moves on into a different creation. By the way, we noticed in this creation, of course, that we have atmosphere and water forming a sphere because it's in a space in which there's no gravity to pull it into any other direction. But in the new heavens and new earth, the earth is no longer a square, it's no longer a globe, a sphere. It is a cube, according to John in Revelation 21. It is 1,500 miles cubed. And on a cube, you wouldn't expect water or seas. Water's not going to flow on the surface of a cube, not in the way it does on a globe. So it seems to fit that God wouldn't need a sea, would take the sea away if he's designed the earth to be a cube. And if that blows your mind, just read chapters 21 and 22 of Revelation. It's just the beginning. All right, day 3, we've started just with land, but then we go a little step further. Verse 11, then God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees on the earth bearing fruit after their kind with seed in them. And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed after their kind, and trees bearing fruit with seed in them after their kind. And God saw that it was good. There was evening and there was morning, a third day. So now we've come to the end of the third day, and what he did on the land now is the last piece of the day. We can see that he's bringing forth plants. How does he bring it forth? Well, you notice it says he brings them out of the ground. They sprout, in other words. They grow. Don't imagine that God just showed up and, like genie, blinked his eyes and then a tree stood there. It says they grew in a day, so they grew fast, supernaturally fast, but they grew. And so they started with a seedling, and they became a sapling, and then they became a full tree. By the end of that 24-hour day, trees like this, we would think, stood in the garden. Now, because of that fact, something interesting just became evident. If you and I lived in the garden at this time, let's say before Adam and woman came along, let's say we could just transport ourselves back in time. We'd have air, we'd have oxygen, we'd have land to stand on, and we'd be surrounded by trees. So we could do it if God let us. And then let's say I brought an axe with me, and we show up at one of these trees, and I cut it down, and it's laying on its side. What would I see inside that tree? Well, I'd probably see this, right? I'd probably see rings, just like you and I do today. The tree grew, after all. But when I look at it and I do the normal thing we do, and I count those rings, and I say, oh, this tree must be 35 years old. How old is the tree? It's 1 day old. It proves to us that when God created, he created things with the appearance of age. With the appearance of age. It's actually 1 day old. But in its appearance, it would appear as though, based on our understanding of how natural forces work, it would appear as though it's been growing for 35, 40 years, whatever the rings would show. But it hadn't. It proves that God in his supernatural power can advance things past the normal of what is expected. That, in other words, he can do things much faster than we would expect to see happen in normal course of nature, but it still has the appearance as though it went in the normal course. Now, why is this so important? Well, because it completely invalidates any attempt to count the age of creation by measuring itself. The day that mountains were made, they looked like they were millions of years old, but they were 1 day old. The day Adam was created, he looked like he was, 25? But he was 1 day old. So if I devise any methodology that attempts to understand the age of the world, and I measure something that exists in the world, it's like a fish inside a fishbowl trying to understand what's outside the fishbowl. You can't know what you don't have access to. I can't understand how old something is if I know it was created with the appearance of age. It completely ruins any of my assumptions about how old anything is. because it was made to look old from the moment God created it. And why did he do that? To fool the evolutionists? Well, I like to think so, but no, that's not his main reason. It has to do with the whole purpose in the creation. Who is the tree for? When we look at what he did with this tree, he sprouted vegetation out of the ground, maturing within a day, but most importantly, with seeds and fruit right away. Who cares about seeds or fruit? Why would it matter? Well, it's certainly not for the tree's own sake. It didn't have to have that fruit for its own sake. I mean, if it was allowed to grow naturally over 30 years, it eventually would have had fruit or whatever, but it didn't need to have fruit on the first day, not for itself. Clearly, there's some other reason why there needs to be fruit on the earth in a rapid way, and we kind of know where we're going, don't we? God declared this development to be good in verse 12. Here again, good for some suitable purpose, some specific outcome. And we ask the question, why is it good that a tree would have fruit so quickly? We'll come back to that. So we leave with these three important observations. God told the trees, the plants and the like, to reproduce after their own kind. And that's a very important phrase. Kind in Hebrew is just the word min, and it's the highest order division of life in creation in the Hebrew language. So, we use terms like species or kingdom or phyla. They simply said min to represent the highest form, the highest order of creation, of life in creation. If I were to chart what min means, what a kind is, it would look something like this. So this is the evolution's view of morphology. The evolutionists would say that we all started with something, and that something over time became everything. One microbe in the middle of a primordial soup eventually gave birth to everything over the course of billions of years or whatever. That's what an evolutionist thinks happened. What we just saw, though, in the story is this. We saw God creating a kind. Let's call it a canine kind. And he created, let's say, a feline kind. And a kind, in the Hebrew understanding of the word, means an animal whose DNA has within it the potential to diversify to a degree within a certain population. And as that population moves out and reproduces, it can gain isolation in certain pockets. For example, the canine kind that God created went out, and in some areas it eventually became a wolf, because in its DNA was all the necessary information for a wolf. But as that population isolated itself, it lost DNA, it lost information to the normal process that we know takes place. And similarly, others would have branched off and created other kinds. They are today now without some of the initial DNA that they started with. That's why they cannot reverse back. A dog can't become a wolf today, and a wolf can't become a fox today. They've lost the ability to cross those lines. But in their original DNA, they trace back to an original kind. Similarly, felines would have had a similar kind of distribution, if you want to call it that, over time. But however they proceeded, the morphology in general would have looked like this. God created many different kinds on day one, some of which never changed, some of which had within their DNA the ability to diversify to some extent. Once they diversify, they can't go backward, because once DNA is lost, you can't create new DNA, which is one of the fundamental flaws of evolution. The process of creating new healthy DNA has never been observed, never has taken place in the animal kingdom, and if it can't happen, then you cannot move up the chain of sophistication, which is what evolution would say happens. So it's not true to say that God made every single animal you see today on day one. It is true to say he made kinds, as the Bible uses the term, and then he asked that they would be reproducing after their own kind, which is to say this. A dog or a cat, a canine or feline or any other type of animal that God created, they were locked into their lane. They could not go outside their lane. By his own word, they're going to reproduce after their kind. They're not going to produce anything except what they are, or some lesser version of the same. But they're never going to be able to go above and beyond. A canine is never going to create an equestrian type, or equestrians aren't going to create primates, and primates aren't going to create humans. That's moving outside your kind by adding new information. That's not something God has provided for in the way he created. But within a general kind, it might diversify downward. So we have kinds leading to the diversity we have today. Secondly, notice the vegetation, as I said earlier, grew out of the ground. So we'll come back to this. Just it's important to note right now, plants were formed from the land. The land itself was the source component for the plants to be made. And that still happens today. Plants grow out of the ground today, just as they did then. And then finally, we noted that plants were fully formed with fruit by the end of that day. They were ready to provide food right from the start. And that'll finish day 3. So we have land, we have plant life now, and that's a space that we will then see filled when we get to day 6.